So can I welcome you all here? It's great to see such a good audience on such a horrible day. I was a bit worried that everyone would look at the weather and think, nah, not going to come. It's great to have Helen here. Helen is very familiar with Churchill. She was an undergraduate and a PhD student here. So she will have seen the college from a rather different perspective from mine. Perhaps I can start off by asking you, what got you into science?
So this is one of those questions that I have a real bee in my bonnet with, just to start off well. And I think that, like most scientists, I just sort of ended up doing it. And I was interested in the way the world worked, and my parents didn't know necessarily a lot of science, but they just said, oh, well, we'll try it out. You know, if I said, why does that do that? They'd say, oh, well, I don't know, let's try it. And so there was never this sort of, I think there's often a sort of thing in science where science is such a weird thing that you must need a really good reason for doing it. Like, what weird, freak of nature happened that you're doing this? And I think most scientists just sort of go, oh, that's quite interesting, and that's quite interesting, and then they sort of follow along. So I don't know about you, but I never had this is why I do science. I do know that I knew I was going to do science because I remember when I chose my GCSEs, I chose to do double science so that I could do an extra language,
right,
or history or something, because it was so obvious I was going to do science later on that I wanted to study more things. But I just sort of rolled into it.
Yes, I mean, I worked out at about 13 that I really liked physics, which is sort of, there's no rationale for it, but to me it made sense of the world. And I think that's really what you're saying too, that it was just natural. And did anyone say, oh, girls don't do physics at that stage?
Not in my hearing. Well, I mean, it helped that my mum was a computer programmer before I was born, and she did maths. She started a physics degree, actually, and she stopped at Bradford University, and she stopped after 6 months because she hated it and because it was very all-male and aggressive and all these things. She went on and carried on, did a bit of maths, and then became a computer programmer. And my dad is not particularly practical, so his family, he was Polish, born in Poland, came to England as a Second World War refugee, and his family were the sort of the teachers and the writers. So in the household I grew up in, it was my mum that did the practical things, and my dad that was the least practical person going. So it never occurred to me that you wouldn't, because the example I had in the house was that, my mum taught me, I remember we had a whiteboard in the kitchen, or a blackboard and then a whiteboard, and she taught me what pi was, and she taught me maths on the board, and which terrified my teachers when I knew about things several layers ahead, but it was just sort of folded in with everything else.
And you said you went to a girls' school.
Yes, and this is a very common theme we were talking about before, that if you talk to women who've carried on in the sciences, quite often they went to an all-girls school. And it's very telling. It's also very sad because, I sort of don't want segregated schools. Humanity is all mixed together, so schools should be all mixed together as far as I'm concerned. And yet, I clearly benefited from an environment where there was no group, because everyone did it. And so quite a lot of girls did physics.
And no one said to you, you shouldn't be doing that. Because what horrifies me when I talk to parents of girls and they report their teacher said, oh, maths isn't a girl thing. Still. And I just cannot believe we are still stuck in this time warp.
It's horrifying.
It is totally horrifying.
And what's horrifying about it is that, I work in university, there's people of all types do all sorts of things. And it's very easy to forget that in the rest of the world, in little primary schools out away from the cities, that's normal.
Yes.
Still. It's really annoying.
And I get worked up about the fact that girls aren't given puzzles to play with that make them able to think in 3D. Now, I should admit, I can't think in 3D. So I was not given the right puzzles. But, but it seems to me that practice makes perfect. And if you start giving children toys that are not going to help them think like that, they won't think like that. And it's very frustrating. And I mean, you're in an engineering department now, so that must be even more obvious.
I started off, I'm a physicist, it's great, and then you rock up in this engineering department and you go, oh. And someone once said to me that it's really interesting, you get the difference between a physicist and an engineer. And the guy, one of the engineers there said to me once, so I was talking about being a physicist, and he said, well, the difference, Helen, between a physicist and an engineer is that an engineer knows when to stop. So I am that, and that is that.
And is that true? Do you not know when to stop?
Well, then the thing is that a physicist, and it is that there is a difference, I think, is that a physicist will keep going because it's interesting. They go, oh, that, I'm going to poke that, and that does something interesting, so I'm going to poke that. Whereas the engineer will go, I've got an aim in mind here.
Yes, I've got to build a bridge.
I've got to build a bridge.
Yes.
There's going to be a day, and someone else said to me, well, there's a day comes when an engineer has to press a button and it has to work or not.
Yes.
And the physicist just doesn't really care, it's just interesting.
Yeah.
And so I am in an engineering faculty now where they are quite practically minded. I can't remember where this question started. That's terrible, isn't it?
No, I can't either. So let us revert to Churchill. You came here. Why did you come here? Why this college?
So I remember looking at the brochure. So people seem to spend a lot of effort on this now. Like when I want to say it's not that long ago since I came here, but it is half my lifetime ago. People didn't. Like now I feel there's so much scrutiny of which college you go to and how you're going to pick, and there's this enormous stress over the choice. And back then, no one really did any of that. They just went, oh, well, that looks all right, I'll go there. And I looked at the brochure, and there were two reasons that I came to Churchill. It had big sports fields out the back, and it had kitchens on site. And most colleges then did not have kitchens. You couldn't make your own food. You went to hall, and that was the end of it. And the sports fields were, sports were a massive part of my life. And so the idea of this being sports fields right out the back was, and it just felt, and then when I came here, I came for an open day, and I also went to FITS, I think, and this just, it felt like a home. It felt like a home I could have.
It's interesting that, because when we've done sort of discussions with students here, and I don't know how many students there are in the audience, one of the things that is frequently said about Churchill is, I arrived and I felt at home. And I don't know, I've not had that conversation with students from other colleges, but it seems a very strong sort of ethos here.
Well, it might just be a surprise because of the brutalist architecture. I mean, if you don't like concrete when you come, you definitely like concrete a bit more when you leave. So it might be the difference between the external sort of view of it. I'm sure there's a college architect who's about to be very disappointed in me. Although I used to sit on the Estates Committee for years and years, and I do remember a discussion with the college architect, and fortunately for all of us, I can't remember who it was at the time, and we were having a discussion about renovating the loos in the staircases, and he wanted to make them proper 1950s sort of black and white everything and very stark, because it was in keeping with the spirit of the college, and we were like, well, we have to live there. And actually, we'd quite like it not to be straight from the 1950s. It's not like Trinity has privies, is it? And eventually, I think we convinced him. But it does. The nice thing here is that it is laid out as a community, and not all colleges. I mean, I guess every college is built for the type of community that exists at the time.
Yes.
And Churchill, the architecture was designed in the late 40s and early 50s. It was that era.
No,
of
it's
design.
a bit later than that.
A bit later, 50s, yeah. 50s, yeah.
Yeah, it was 50s.
But the thinking that went into it,
yes.
And it's very communal. The actual, it's very open. Those big windows along the corridors.
Yes.
It's a very open. It's not a closed-in environment where everyone's shut off.
No,
it's a big
and
community.
the new court. I don't know if you've been in Cullen Court.
I haven't seen it yet.
So it's got this wonderful central courtyard, and the sort of circulation looks over it, and all the rooms look out over the playing fields.
Right.
And that seems a very successful design, and sort of in keeping with the rest of the building, but also utterly modern and different, as it were. Yeah. And that seems to have worked very well. But I think, that, again, the circulation space and the window seats.
Yes.
The
window seats are brilliant.
Exactly.
I grew a wasp's nest under mine accidentally one year. I made these big
Didn't
cushions.
Didn't the senior tutor know that?
I don't know, never asked him. But I had these big cushions, and I used to sit them, any of you who are students will know the windows open outwards over these big window seats, and I had a cushion that sat on the window seat. And there were a lot of wasps one year, and I didn't really know why. And then when I came to clear out my room at the end of the year, I realised that the edge of my cushion had been kind of overhanging, and there's this little warm pocket underneath, and there was an entire wasp's nest in there. And I'd just not noticed. I'd just been, there's lots of wasps. But yeah, so me and the wasps had a great...
safety issues here too.
Yeah, whatever. It was fine.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't master at the time.
But it is, it's a very... The environment creates the community in a lot of ways, and it's a great environment to have.
And I hope that our students today still feel that. I mean, you are a few years back.
Thanks for reminding me.
Well, it's all right. You've just told me I lectured you. So,
It's true.
so after you're an undergraduate, you then went off for a bit?
I thought I'd do a PhD if I could find something that interested me. So I decided I wanted to go and work in Canada, because why not? And so I looked through all the websites of all the Canadian physics departments, which frankly didn't take very long. And I wrote an email to every single department in Canada in physics that was doing anything that I thought was remotely interesting, which was 6 of them. And I sort of said, I've got a degree in physics. I don't know anything about what you do. I'd quite like to learn. Can I come and work for you? And so I sent 6 emails and I got 2 job offers. So I went to Canada and worked as a research assistant at the University of Toronto in the atmospheric physics department. And the most notable thing about the atmospheric physics department was that it was 16 floors high, and I had an experiment right at the top in the freezing cold in Canada in the winter. So I was sent up there to build this thing. And so I did that, and then I went to Costa Rica and I studied Spanish for a bit, and then I went to New Zealand and I worked there for a bit. So with the money I earned from being a research assistant in Canada, that paid for me to carry on and do volunteer work. And then in Canada, so I was in this atmospheric physics department, which is basically what I discovered is that atmospheric physics, certainly in that department, what the physicists were there to do was to build the kit for the chemists, and the chemists did the actual science, and the physicists were sort of glorified technicians. They just built the widget. And I was not really up for that. And then there were a very famous atmospheric scientist came to talk, and she was one of the ones who discovered the ozone hole over Antarctica. And she was and everyone was extremely excited that this woman had turned up. And she came round and she looked down her nose at all our experiments, told you all doing that wrong. And then she gave this talk to the entire physics department. And everyone was tremendously excited. And everyone came out and they were in tears of inspiration. And wasn't it wonderful? And my God, I thought it was the most boring thing I had ever heard. And so I wrote an email that night to my master's supervisor back here saying, I'm going to come back and do a PhD because I'm not staying here. Because I thought if I liked it, I might carry on. So I carried on with the other things, and then I ended up back here as a PhD student for another 3 and a bit, 4 years.
And did that get you into an ocean?
No, so my PhD, to the surprise of literally everybody at the time, including me, was on explosives physics. And the reason that was a surprise is that I spent, when I was an undergraduate here, I was the green officer for 2 years. I pushed very hard on ethical issues. I was telling Athene before, in this hall many years ago, for hustings for green officer, I did a backflip down the front, got me the job. And so I spent a lot of time talking about ethical issues and recycling, and I don't know if Jennifer Rigby's here, but she will certainly remember me banging on about lots of things to do with the environment. And then everyone said, so what are you going to do for your PhD, Helen? I'm going to blow stuff up. Everyone, But the reason for it was that I'd worked in that lab as an undergraduate, for a master's project, and it let me build experiments. And what I really wanted to do was build experiments. And it was lasers and impact experiments. It was very mechanical thinking. And it was problem solving at this kind of scale.
So it wasn't the results you were interested in, it was getting to the results.
It was building the kit. And there were interesting problems in the physics of that I dealt with, and I built these experiments and did a lot of high-speed photography before it was easy. Like high-speed photography now is basically straightforward because you've got CMOS sensors that just deal with things. But back then it was quite a lot harder, and so I saw they used to send us the prototypes of high-speed cameras to play with. That was the lab where these things got tested out. And it was really the high-speed photography that was interesting. So when I finished my PhD, I'd never wanted anything to do with the defense world, ever. And I'm glad that I saw it. And I'm glad that, and part of the thing I did when I took on that PhD, because I wanted to do that type of experiment, was I said, well, I can live in this nice little world where I deny that wars are ever fought and that nasty things ever have to happen. But if I do this, at least I see a little bit of that world and I know what it is. I don't have to deal with it ever again, but at least I've faced up to the reality of the way the world works. But then when I got to my end of my PhD, I definitely wasn't interested in any of that. And also, it wasn't really going anywhere. Like, it had a very narrow focus. And so I looked for another field. So I finished my PhD. I spent 6 months writing up papers and that kind of thing. then I looked for another field that involved the same type of experiment. And it was really hard because everything was either nano whatever or cosmology. And there was very little physics in the middle. And I wanted to do the physics in the middle. And it turned out that part of my lab had Alan Walton in it, and he had done bubble research. And so John Field, who was my PhD supervisor, sort of said, oh, will you have a chat to him? And so I found bubbles, and then I was put in contact with someone in San Diego, and I ended up in an oceanography institute to study bubbles because I could do high-speed photography. And then I sort of discovered the ocean entirely by accident because I thought I was well-educated. Nobody in Cambridge in 4 years had mentioned the oceans.
Well, I'm trying to think who works on oceans in Cambridge now.
There are a few. Peter Wadhams is here at this college, isn't he? But I didn't have anything to do with him then. So I sort of discovered the oceans, and once I discovered the oceans, there was no looking back.
So that was what you really wanted to do?
Yeah, and so being able to do physics at the right kind of scale out in the world, that was what I wanted to do. And then it just kind of carried on, and it fitted in with so many other bits of my life that the nice thing about studying the oceans is that you're often out in the outsides. So I could work outdoors and do practical work outdoors, as well as doing the physics and the intellectually satisfying bit indoors.
Not so good for sport.
Well, I do.
Deck quoits.
Yeah, the gym on a ship is not, it's a kind of necessary, you have to go. The gym on a ship is normally a room that is literally this size, and it might have a cross-trainer thing in it and a bike if you're lucky. But I spend an hour in it a day when I'm at sea. The best ship I was ever on was out in the Pacific, and in the middle of the Pacific, so it was quite warm. And the second mate had a rowing machine on the top deck of the ship. So if you were nice to him, you could go and row across the Pacific on the top of the ship, which is the most interesting a rowing machine has ever been, because those things are dire, but it's really good exercise. So being on ship isn't always the most active thing. But now I do, I paddle outrigger canoes. One of my colleagues is in the audience, I think, one of my teammates doing that. And if you're out on the ocean, it's an active thing to do. Right. And that fits in perfectly with
So is it being out on the ocean, or is it because you care passionately about the ocean or the physics you can do?
It's everything. It's brilliant. That's the best thing about it, is that the ocean kind of ties all these things together. It's an extremely difficult physical environment to work in. So there's all these problems, like it's the sort of problem solving when you're building an experiment. Like, how do you get a measuring device into this part of the ocean, which is only a metre below what everyone's always seen, but it's really hard to get to. And so there's that, and there's just, I'm quite good at lifting boxes and logistics, and there's a lot of that. And then there's being out in the outside and the outer environment. So there's all these, and then there's the culture of the ocean and how human beings relate to the ocean, which is my sort of next bee in my bonnet, if you like. And so all of these things this is fascinating. It covers all these bases. And so I'm very happy having accidentally found the oceans several years later.
And when did you accidentally find the BBC or TV work? Or
They found me. So when I was here as a PhD student, I got asked a lot to do, we had those open days at the Cavendish, and I had a Magdeburg spheres, best experiment ever. So if you don't know what Magdeburg spheres are, there's sort of two metal, you can have them in various sizes. I think the ones we had were about this big, and they're two halves of a sphere that are just put together. They're not attached in any way, but then you take out all the air from the inside, so you have a vacuum on the inside, atmospheric pressure pushing in, and then what we had was two ropes, so the public could pull out and the atmosphere could push in. We could have a massive tug of war, and it was brilliant. And so I did things like that, and I sort of found accidentally that the best day was the day when someone had brought a steam engine to one of those open days, and we had the steam engine on one side and all the adults on the other. And they could pull these spheres apart. It's surprisingly difficult. I've just filmed that, actually, for a series on temperature that's about to come out. And so we did Magdeburg spheres, and we had two 4x4s for spheres this big. And it takes two 4x4s in, four-wheel drive to pull them apart.
Yeah, I heard of another university which was doing it with cart horses.
Yeah. So I did things like that, and then I went to America, and I recognised when I went. So that was all during my PhD, and when I after my PhD, the oceanography stuff was in the States, and I recognised at the time that I was talking to the public a lot. But going to America was walking away from it, because America did not know what science communication was, and no idea, just didn't exist. And I was just starting to, I wasn't thinking about big stuff. I was just playing with experiments. And then, so I cleared off to the States. And then 4 years later, literally the day I landed back in the UK, I get an email from someone at the BBC saying, oh, well, we found one of my American universities has videoed me doing something. We found a video of you doing this. We're looking for someone to present the show. Do you want to come and audition? And I was like, well, these telly people talk, whatever, I'll go along. And yeah, so they asked me to go and audition, and I never believed in any of it, basically. Telly people talk a lot, And then I was the one that popped out at the other end of this process. So it was never, and the nice thing is that I never asked to be there, which is a much, like, I think there's a lot of people who think they want to be on TV and they don't know what it is or what it means, but they think they want to be on TV. And the thing is that if you want to be on TV, you look terrible on TV. If you're even thinking about the fact it's you that's doing it, you've already lost the battle. And so it actually, the fact that I never really cared about it, I'd never watched TV. I never owned a TV until 4 years after I started being on it. Never watched it. So I just didn't care. So I could just do what I thought was interesting.
So you think most people who want to do it get very self-conscious? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah. And it shows. You can see. And so you tend to find the people who are good presenters are the ones who just care about the subject, and it shows. And it's the same in any subject. I'm friends with Yanina Ramirez, who's a history presenter. And also an academic historian at Oxford. And she's like me, her hair is permanently like this, and she's just talking about art history in her case. And she gets these hilarious emails from people saying, well, we liked your programme, but we really did think you ought to have had a hairbrush in scene 3. And she's like, mate, doesn't care, so, and it's a much less stressful way to be.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was never intentional, but the communication has always fascinated me. Like the languages, it was where it started really. In language, I grew up in a household. My dad, Polish was his first language, German was his third, and so I heard languages spoken all the time. And I wanted to learn to speak other languages, and communication has always been, always that even though I wasn't always very good at it, but I always wanted to do it. And
did the BBC train you, or did they just let you?
No. The only thing they did was they said to me at the start, I had a really good series producer on that first series, and he said to me, look, you can do the bit that's really, really hard. We can teach you everything else. They did. So they did. The first 2 directors I worked with spent time saying, try doing it like this, try doing it like this, and presenting is a bit like surfing in a sense. Is you've got to know it. You've got to know where you are, but not look down. And that there's this, it's like surfing your own personality. The only thing they sent me for a proper lesson for was they sent me along, they said, do you know about makeup? And I said, no. And they sent me along to the makeup artist of the One show and for a makeup lesson. And so I turned up, and I mean, makeup artists are lovely people. One of my best friends now is a makeup artist. She's a very intelligent, very lovely woman. But when you first meet a makeup artist, they're very lovely. And so she sat me down in front of this mirror, and she made up one half of my face properly. And I was then supposed to copy her and do the other half. But I wish I'd taken a picture of that moment, because you see, it was such a fascinating thing, because you see the optical illusions, right? Both halves of it are your face. But they're not the same, and you look lopsided because of all these optical illusions. And I had been pitching a program for years on the biology and physics of makeup, because why do you want to look like that for a star? Why is it that you can create things that look like shadows that make it look like you've got high cheekbones or whatever? And then, so the physics of how the optical illusion works and the biology of why you'd want to look like that, no one's ever gone for it. But, so that's the only thing that they taught. And then she produced this list. She said, oh, you hardly need any makeup at all. And I was like, well, good. And then she produced a list of 13 things that was hardly any makeup at all. And oh my God, the people who do need makeup must be here for weeks.
Well, clearly I could never go on TV because I'm allergic to makeup.
The thing is, I never thought, it's one of those nice things though, isn't it, about human life and about culture, is that everything is interesting if you look at it enough. And you don't have, the thing you want to be interested in isn't necessarily the thing that everyone thinks you should be interested in. And I'm not doing down anyone who, wears makeup. My sister wears a lot of makeup, but she's very good at it. And she says it's like doing art in the morning, and she actually enjoys the process of putting it on because it's like creating a work of art every morning that's different, and she really enjoys that. Brilliant. I don't think anyone should feel under pressure to put makeup on, but I think it's fascinating. There's always something interesting. Like, humans do all these interesting things. And it's great to just, there's always something to look at. It's brilliant.
But you've not succeeded in the pitching for the makeup program
Well,
yet.
they did. They nearly went for it, but then they turned it into this horrible thing about the face, and they wanted to watch to film a face transplant operation. It sort of was becoming a freak show, and that's where, TV's urge to do dramatic, novel, new things that are, are overhyped by definition, collided with reality, and I find it very frustrating.
There'd be a part of me that would be nervous about doing a program about makeup because, well, you're a woman, you would do that, wouldn't you? I mean, there was this ghastly video the EU put out. You must have seen this one.
Started Science Girl, that.
Oh, right. And it lasted about 24 hours on the web, and it was meant to be getting young girls into science. You can still find it on the web, though the EU took it down. And it was, they were meant to be, 14-year-olds or something, and they were highly sexualized, and it was all about makeup, and the whole thing just made me
There were little
cringe.
molecules floating around or something,
Yeah,
weren't there? There were some awful little here's the chemistry.
Drawing on the sort of transparent screen with makeup and things. And I just get very nervous about, it's the stereotyping. This is what women should be interested in. And because I worked on starch, I had people say, well, you only do that because it's domestic science. And you think, that... One has to be slightly careful about how one projects these things. Maybe you have enough of a sort of BBC screen presence, you don't have to worry. But if it were your first program, I can't imagine you'd have wanted to pitch for makeup. Yeah,
no, I wouldn't. And it is, you're right that there is a very interesting fine line where you hit the things that are fit the stereotypes are also interesting.
Yes.
But you don't how you talk about them is difficult, and you don't want to fall into the traps. But if you talk about it well enough, if you don't talk the rubbish, you usually sort of bypass that. And there's a lot of telly cliches, which I spend my life fighting against, but make telly people feel very comfortable. And they also make the audience feel comfortable. That's the frustrating bit. I don't mind telly people being telly people. Many of them are lovely. But they do have this sort of hyping mind. What frustrates me is that people respond. They're not wrong. People respond to the stock phrases. And it's intensely frustrating. There's so many interesting things to say. And yet people respond to this simplistic phrase which really doesn't tell the story.
Such as?
Oh, well, I have to be careful here. All right, so I have got a hive, and it's not just a bee in my bonnet, it's a hive and the bonnet isn't big enough. But one of the things is this phrase that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about Earth's oceans, right? Winds me up, because it's wrong. And it is wrong for lots of reasons. And for example, there's a lot more to know about the ocean. It's got living things in it, for a start. It's got very complicated geology underneath. It's shifting and moving, it's an engine. The moon is lovely, but it's basically dead, and it doesn't change very much. And so it's a false comparison. Yeah. It is true that the surface of the moon might be mapped to higher resolution over more of its surface than the oceans are, but it's completely beside the point. It's a straw man argument. But people love that phrase. And so in Blue Planet 2, they upgraded it sneakily to something which also isn't relevant, which is that we know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the surface of the ocean, which doesn't help. But the point is, people respond to that phrase. And it's one of those things where I can spend my time fighting against it because it's wrong, or I can just go, you know what, this person now wants to be interested in the ocean, so shut up, Helen, and let them find out, does it, if they believe the right thing for the wrong reasons, does it matter? And that's what those stock phrases are all about. They're about the getting people to believe the right thing for the wrong reason. But it's an emotionally comfortable reason, and that's why it works. But I find that very frustrating because I think that there are emotionally comfortable reasons that are accurate. And if you can have both, that's the ideal. And that's why it's hard work to do.
But you write your own scripts?
Yes. So everything I say, some people work in different ways. I research everything for myself. I check everything for myself. I spend a lot of time thinking about phrasing and wording and how to use the environment I'm in to make a point. And I think because that's the contribution I can make, right? I can see the way to make the telly thing work, but I can also see the accurate science. And the thing is, I sometimes feel that people, tellers of stories in many ways, underestimate science. They think it's that boring thing, it can't possibly be interesting, so we'll have to make something up, we'll have to use hyperbole, the biggest and the best and the oldest and the greatest, because no one is going to be interested unless it's the biggest ever. which is wrong. It's just lazy. So my problem with hyperbole in TV is that it's lazy. That if you tell someone, oh, this is the biggest, what you're effectively saying to them is, I want you to care about this, but I'm not going to tell you why. Whereas if you tell them why, then you've got a real reason for being interested and a foundation to step onto other things. If you just go the biggest, the conversation ends there.
Yes.
But if you actually say, well, this is an engine or whatever it is that works in this way, that you're living on, depending on every moment of your lives, and it's true, then you start another conversation.
And would you ever do a programme, say, that was about wasps' nests or something? That was
That's clearly worried you.
I have to take my responsibilities seriously. But, okay, I was thinking of something biological, and that was just quite close, because it wouldn't be close to your research area. And if you take Brian Cox, who's done programmes in many different areas and fantastically successfully, but he probably hasn't read all the papers underpinning that. Would you feel comfortable doing that?
So there's a lot to say in the answer to that question. So the first thing is there's two things that a scientist can really contribute, I think, in this. And one is a proper understanding, our best understanding of the knowledge of whatever it is. And the other thing is perspective. And the thing that scientists people think science is about facts, but actually those of us in the audience, here in the room who are fortunate enough to be trained in science, it does give you a different perspective on the world. And I think that the job of sharing science is also about sharing that perspective. So there are some things where I think a non-specialist can convey perspective. They can convey the perspective of a scientist on that issue. And in that case, I'm all right talking about it. But, you do the research and you make sure that because the big arguments, especially as a physicist, because we tend to think that we've got energy and momentum, we've got everything. Energy and matter, sorted. Everything else is a consequence of energy and matter. So if there's a perspective that comes from that, then I'm comfortable talking about it. But there are definitely things that I've said no to because that is not my thing. And fine, I could do a lot of research, but if there's another presenter who I know can provide the perspective and knows the subject, then it's better that it's them.
And, you started off by saying that you really liked building things. One of the things I believe passionately about when trying to explain science is it's the process of science. I'm not a builder, but I want people to understand the analytical process, the way the scientists are critical, and you don't just read the advertisements and think that's how it is. Is that part of what you're trying to put across in your program?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because the sort of thinking on this has changed quite a lot in the past few years. Now, if you talk to a science festival and what they're trying to do, they're all about process. They're all about, we're going to show people how to be scientists. We'll let them do things, which is fine. But I think they're in danger of forgetting that using those processes, we're doing quite well with knowledge. And so I see that there's two pillars of science. There's the method, which is the heart of science. But then there's quite a lot of things that we have found out using that method. And some of them are a bit fuzzy around the edges, and we don't really know whether that's the way the world works. But you know what? The day I drop an apple and it goes up, then we'll have a discussion about gravity. Until then, it's all right. This is how it works. And so there's two things. The process and the thinking process is very important, but everything is getting pushed so far that way. I do worry sometimes that we're in danger of forgetting that human civilization has built up this amazing bank of knowledge, and we also have to not forget that. It's unheard of. Most science festivals now, you will almost never see a person standing up talking about one subject that isn't interactive in some way, or that isn't sort of, And the thing is that there's still a lot, it's still valid. It's not the only thing, but it's still valid. And so we somehow need to show that science is both of those things. And of course, the process comes first because that's the only reason you trust. You have to understand where it comes from. But there are also a lot of things that we're quite good at. Yes,
I suppose it's the way that people swallow fake news, if you like, but in a scientific context that I feel so much we have to counter that. And my experience of the Cambridge Science Festival is people do still talk about single subject science. So,
well, good, good. I think, So I'm just, because I said that, and then as you said that, I think I'm giving a talk on a single subject at the Cambridge Science Festival this year. But in the terms of the committee meetings where they think about vision and all
and there's
of that.
very much arts meets science and all the rest of it, which is hugely important because, Churchill is a college with 70% STEM focus. absolutely. But the arts people are really important, and the archives are really important, and I can say that with the archivist in the audience. And
Hello,
one has to bring these things together. But on the other hand, you can overdo the mixing, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's an ecosystem, and I think the thing that worries me a lot about a lot of these discussions is that the aim of the discussion seems to be, let's find the way we are going to talk about science. There's one thing we're all going to talk about. We're going to do interactive things, right? And the problem is that that's a thing. Let's develop that thing. Let's find out all the wonderful ways it works. But let's not forget that there's other things. And the thing is that the way people take in science, it comes in different places in different ways. And what you want is a breadth of types. And that doesn't mean we have to abandon the old ways of doing it. It just means they have to be incorporated into the ecosystem. And I'm very suspicious of the magic pill approach. Where anyone who says this is going to solve all your problems in life, like, don't trust them.
But it's also, I mean, exactly the same that you fell in love with oceans. I mean, I started off working on metals, which didn't do a great deal for me. And when I started working on polymers, I was much happier. People like different things, and feminizing science teaching by having lipstick may be fine for some and absolutely turn off others. And I think you're right. You've got to have a sort of mix and match and just see what takes. And I'm not sure school education always achieves that terribly well.
I always feel very sorry for school teachers, though, because everyone gets at them. Like, it's a hard job. And
I wasn't actually getting at the
teachers,
teachers, I was getting at the curriculum.
But the thing is, there's so much to learn. And what's interesting now, as a university academic now who sees undergraduates teaches undergraduates, is that they don't know very much, but they're much more confident at talking. But sometimes I wish they knew a bit more. And the problem is, there's a finite amount of time. Yeah. It's very hard. Everyone's, they should teach that at school. And the poor teachers, who are getting fewer in number, it seems, as time goes on, are sort of responsible for all these things. And when I came to university, my dad, who is not given to grand statements, said to me, I'm wondering if this is going to raise the same eyebrow as the wasp's nest. He said to me, if you go to university and all you come away with is a degree, you've wasted half your time. That's a direct quote, because it really made an impression on me. And what he was saying, and and it's a thing that a lot of people say in various ways, is that academic education, yes, very good, work hard at it, but it's not the only type of education there is.
No.
And the time I spend here building props for performances on this stage, out in the playing fields, running the green recycling thing in the JCR, like, all of those are also education.
But you're using the word education, and unfortunately, I think some of our leaders think in terms of training, and they think you come to university to get trained to go out and earn a lot of money. And we've lost, unfortunately, and I think Cambridge maintains it better than many places. We're very fortunate. We have lost the idea of education, finding yourself. I mean, education, the classic scholars in the audience will know, it means drawing out. And you are meant to find out who you are when you're a 18-year-old. You should not just be having facts stuffed in your brain.
Yeah, and I knew who I was. I just remembered something as you were saying that really, this was the best thing about college. In my final year, it must have been just after exams at the start of the summer, I wandered past the Porter's Lodge, and I think with Basil, someone said, Helen, we've got something for you. And all right. And they had found a wheelie bin in the college pond. And they went, I know what we're going to do with that. We're going to give it to Helen because she's going to do recycling things with it. And that was, they'd worked out who I was. I did take it. I took it up with a spray power washer thingy up the top of the playing fields. And I cleaned this thing out and I turned it into a recycling bin. And that sort of, everyone finds these things out and you all work together to get things done and people learn the personalities and then good things happen. And that's what you want. You want good things to happen. I think people, all this tick box culture, you forget that the aim is for good things to happen. And good things don't necessarily have a label or a tick box. And it's very easy to be sucked in by a culture that wants training boxes and that kind of thing.
One of the reasons Cambridge is so fortunate is we exist in college-sized entities where people can know you. And, I mean, you're now at UCL, where students will live in outer Croydon or Finchley or wherever, and they will not have that chance to build up a community. Utterly different environment. I mean, we are, fantastically fortunate in a place like this because you can get to know each other, and the supervisors really know the students.
Yeah, it's one of those things you only, people say you only appreciate what you had when you leave, but that sort of thing is, once you know it exists, you can think about creating it in other places, but you have to know it exists. And that was the biggest thing about having been here, was knowing it was possible. And the nice thing, I mean, I walked into college this afternoon and I was recognising people, and the way I wandered out and through the fellows, the corridor and out to the Master's Lodge, and I recognised people, and the family stays.
Was Baz in the Porter's Lodge?
No, he wasn't. But
he's still around.
But that's an immensely rare thing to have, that kind of security where there's an environment you walk back into and you're at home, even if you haven't been there for, 6 months or a year or whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, I haven't actually asked you if you're prepared to take answers from questions from the floor.
Oh, definitely take answers from the floor. Let's do it the other way around.
Right, yes, all right. You throw questions out. But I assume you're willing.
Yes, of course.
So we have some roving mics, I believe. Excellent. Thank you. So who'd like to
It'd be brave and put a hand up.
Yes, quite. Who'd like to ask a question? Right, one right in the middle there.
And well done. So this is I pay attention to this, right? Almost always, the first person to put their hand up to ask a question is a bloke. So congratulations, that woman there, for putting her hand up anyway.
And the studies show of academic seminars that if the first person who asks a question is a bloke, women find it even harder to ask questions.
So you've done everyone a service. Go on then.
Hi, I just want to ask, what do you think about GMOs?
Genetically modified organisms you're talking about here. Yeah. So here's the thing. There's a difference between a technology and the application of the technology. And I think that the GMO the case of genetic modification is an enormous lesson for the scientific community, because the technology and its applications were confused right from the start, and no one ever separated them out into two separate things. And, genetic modification takes an enormous number of variations. The reason that we have the insulin for diabetics, for example, is commonly available now, is that somebody shifted a gene from something into some little bug that was going to grow insulin, right? That is genetic modification. And initially when it came up with the big companies, the GM row, the real argument was about how they were using it. And it was about power. It was about who had control of these genes and who was controlling whether they spread in the environment. And that's a different issue. So I have no problem with genetic modification in itself, because it demonstrably produces things like medicine. It demonstrably can be used in ways that gets rid of malaria, for example, dengue fever. It does bring with it a load of extremely difficult ethical issues. And there's a fabulous book that came out last year called The Gene by Siddharth Mukherjee, something like that. It's fabulous. Anyone who is interested in genetics, and even if you're not, I highly recommend that book, because it goes through the history of how knowledge of genetics grew. And the middle part of the book is all about those debates. And it finishes with the debates of the future, because now we're at the stage where modifying the human genetics in the way that will pass through generations is now possible. So I don't have a problem with the technology itself existing, but I do think that we need to have a very clear discussion about what we do with it, because it's scientifically possible doesn't mean it should be done. And the assumption is that if a company is making it, it will be done. And maybe that's a good assumption. So I think the term genetic modification is one of those terms that society, frankly, needs to move on from. Because the number of things it encompasses is so large, and so many different ethical issues are involved, that we need to sort of take that loaded term, leave that behind, and then talk about actually the specifics. Instead of labeling a whole, you're for or against this one big thing, let's actually look at the nuance and what it means, because some things that come from genetic modification are going to make a vast difference to our own species and our survival and our comfort and our health. And they also might cause enormous problems. And so it's like being against pens, So I don't, but it's a really interesting debate. And it's got really interesting lessons for, the next debates that come on, and one of those is going to be who owns space, right? Who gets to go to the moon, take things from it, land on it. But we need to learn the lessons of that ethical debate. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for... Oh, I don't think it works. Oh, thank you for the wonderful conversation as well.
Gosh.
Another question. One in the middle here.
Did you ever have, whilst you were studying or going into physics, like a crisis of confidence as whether this was really what you wanted to dedicate your life to? Did you ever think, oh, maybe I should go and do art or something?
Well, I've never thought I was dedicating my life to it, but so the answer is mostly no, except for I do remember there's a day here when the form comes around. You do natural sciences, I did physics, material science, and geology, maths, and then the form comes around for filling in the second year thing, and I was pretty sure I wanted to do physics and carry on up that route. And I do remember looking at the form and thinking about the other physicists in my year and thinking, do I really want to spend the next 3 years with them? Because you think the stereotypes are bad now. So I hate the Big Bang Theory. I hate the Big Bang Theory with a passion because I lived that. I lived in those lectures where you would turn up and there'd be a grunt, if you were lucky. And so the only time I ever questioned it, I didn't really care what people thought ever, which is extremely useful. I do remember thinking, that the type of people who generically seem to do physics are not generally my type of people. But there are some very good ones. And, the ones I really got on with were brilliant. And, all of them were mostly all right. But that was the only one where I just remember looking at the Cavendish and going... And then I filled in the form anyway, and it was, double advanced physics and maths.
That was the kind of crisis of confidence she probably had in mind.
No, it wasn't. But I've never... because I've always been lucky that you have a habit of trying things out, and if you try things out and they don't go wrong, you learn that you can try things out again. So the people I feel most sorry for, I guess, in life in a lot of ways, are the people who try something, and the first time they try something that's slightly out of their comfort zone or slightly different, it goes wrong. Because then your lesson is it can go wrong. But if you try a thing and it sort of goes all right, then you know it's possible. So even if the second one fails, you've still got that first one to hang on to. And I wasn't completely confident. I mean, Athene knows this because I've told her. I'm still not sure she believes me. But when I was here as an undergraduate, I was fantastically shy. You can't shut me up now, clearly. But I really was so terrified of social situations. I could stand on the stage and talk about, environment issues, or when I had something to say, I could talk. But I was so shy when I was here for years. And it was it was an environment that helped me get through that. But that was a different type of crisis, I think, and it took a long time to get over that. And I remember maybe the year after I left here, when I was at Spanish school in Costa Rica, and we were somewhere on the beach, after a few drinks, and someone said, "What's the thing you're proudest of?" And I remember at the time, I said getting a first from Cambridge and getting over the shyness, and those are two equal things, because they were easily the two biggest achievements. So it wasn't that it was always easy at all, but I've always been stubborn, and I have always not been afraid to work hard, and I've always just, there's a kind of, if when life hits you in the face, you get up and you keep trying. And so that gets you a long way.
One just behind.
Thank you. Hi, I'm an engineer, and I have two daughters.
We won't hold it against you.
I apologise. I have two daughters who are considering perhaps chemistry.
Oh, the eyebrow.
Or
you
biology.
should have all seen the eyebrow that came from the seat next to her. Go on, sorry.
I was just wondering if you can think of why things like chemistry and medicine and veterinary science are now acceptable for girls, but engineering, physics still have this very difficult acceptance within society. What's the difference?
We live in a very gendered society, and if you need convincing of that, Cordelia Fine's books are superb, not just the one that it won, didn't it? The
it
book
did,
prize
Testosterone
this year.
Rex,
Yeah, Testosterone,
yes.
but the
The
delusions of
earlier
gender
one.
as well, yeah. So, and the problem with a gendered society, and it's not just gender, right? There's all kinds of diversity problems in various ways. Gender's just quite an obvious one because it's 50% of the population. Stereotypes are very prevalent, and I think they are changing. So chemistry, actually, it's interesting that you list chemistry as being more acceptable, because certainly when I was an undergraduate, the chemists had the worst problem than anyone. Their gender ratio was worse than the physicists, and it was worse than the engineers. So maybe they've had a
No, it's about
step up.
50-50 here now.
Is it? Yeah, that's a huge improvement. But I think that I don't know. I wish I did know. I think the problem now is the social pressure, that in a world where there's so much social media, and people feel that people are looking at them all the time. They sort of want to be looked at all the time. There's this idea that what you look like should matter. I'm a northerner, right? One of the things I found hardest about living in southern England is that everyone cared about what they looked like. I mean, not necessarily just in an aesthetic way, but the sort people had a persona, an image, and they knew where their image was, and they kind of carried it around with them like a shield. I'm from up near Lancashire. No one gives a stuff about that. If they think you're an idiot, they'll tell you. And so I find it very... So I grew up in an environment where there were very few sort of... no one cared about what people thought of them. And I think the problem with social media now is that everyone has an idea of what people think of them. And I think I think that's a large part of it. I think we've gone beyond the stage that says women can't do this, and we're now on, for some horrible reason, women shouldn't do this. And that's to do with the perception. And yet there's so many brilliant women doing these subjects. There's no shortage of role models, I think. It's just that there's this sort of feeling that women don't, if you care about your image, it doesn't fit. We're social animals. We want to fit in with our society. That's what enables human civilizations to work, is that we all have an inbuilt idea of what society expects from us. And so I think that those subjects are still the ones where it's felt that it's not quite, a woman doesn't fit. But I couldn't tell you, there are a lot of role models now, and things are changing. And the great jobs in those things, whatever you're interested, there's so many interesting things, and you have so much more agency in terms of getting things done if you have a training in subjects like engineering and physics. So there's no simple answer to your question. I mean, there's books been written on it, but there's no one sentence answer. But the fundamental thing is do what interests you, do it anyway, because why not, right? What's the worst thing that's going to happen? And the problem is a lot of people hold themselves back. I discovered this when I started going around to talk to schools a lot. And I remember actually talking about when I worked in Canada, and I came back and I, years later, told these kids that I'd gone to work in Canada. And they said, "Oh, who said you could do that?" And I said, well, no one. But people put brakes on themselves. And that, in a way, is the most depressing thing to see in life. It's an awful thing to see someone holding someone else back. For me, it's worse to watch someone holding themselves back, even if that's a consequence of the culture that they're in. And so just do it anyway. And that's one of the things that I think, I've never been a big fan of the phrase role models. But sometimes, if somebody else has been bonkers, it's okay for you to be bonkers. And sometimes just having examples of people who have done things they weren't supposed to do is all right, because they're still alive, usually. So why not? Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's hard and it's so frustrating. And we both get very frustrated and irritated about these things.
Speak out about it, yes. There was a question there.
Thanks.
I don't know if there are any on that side of the road.
So you spoke about how people really connect with hype about science, and I was wondering if you thought that was more useful or more counterproductive in instances where science has become politicised.
Oh, you do like cans of worms, you lot, don't you? Yeah, so there are big societal questions about this, and there are things that scientists have to think very carefully about. So that one example that comes to mind, for example, is that after Hurricane Sandy, a few years ago in the US, the percentage of the US population that believed in man-made climate change went up by 10%, from a fairly low bar, but it went up. And so that it's one of those things of people believing the right thing for the wrong reason. And the thing that scientists have to grapple with, I think, here is that there's lots of reasons for trying to convince someone of something. So you might be trying to convince them because there's something in it for you. You might be trying to convince them because you want to share a good thing. You might be trying to convince them because you want to help them do something else, right? And it's complicated, right? So the answer of whether or not hype is beneficial sometimes depends on why you're trying to convince them. In the case of climate change, right now, I would take Hurricane Sandy because I think the issue is so important that we cannot afford to have people waiting to believe in the right thing for the right reason. We have to deal with it. And so in that case, I think a bit of hype, you know, if it works, it's so important that I would kind of bite my lip about it. But generally in those cases, you're setting yourself up for a fall, because inevitably if you're hyping something, you know, science is about probabilities. That means if there's a 95% chance that this thing is right, you do that 20 times, the probability that you're going to be wrong goes up. It's going to happen once. And then you risk your integrity, your reputation, because you've been wrong once and that's all it takes. So it depends on the questions you want to believe things. There's a very good book by Evan Davis called Post-Truth that discusses, it was published last year, that discusses all of this. And he's very clear about the reasons for people telling white lies and other sorts of lies. And his attitude is you have to understand it in order to make that judgment. But it's always a judgment call. You know, if everyone had to be perfectly right about everything all the time, the world would slow down a lot, because we're not rational creatures. However much great institutions of learning try and turn us into entirely rational professional beings, we're still human. And you can't ignore that. And so I think hype is generally not a good thing, but I can see that there are times when the reason for persuasion is so important that you effectively tell a white lie. It's like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. But you have to think about the ethics of it. And science doesn't generally think about these ethical issues. They just get cross about stuff being wrong. But there's more nuance in it than that. And I think we have to face up to the nuance, and that not all of the world is our nice little scientists. We're going to categorize everything into these 5 categories, and then we're going to, you know, it's not like the standard model of physics where we've got a little diagram that says, well, there's some of these, and there's 3 of those, and those are two types of that. Life isn't like that. So scientists need to get better at dealing with the nuance of the rest of the world. But yeah, hype is a problem. But that book is brilliant. I highly recommend it. I should be giving shorter answers. I'm really sorry.
That's okay.
Too opinionated.
Some more questions. There's one right at the front here. And the men are allowed to ask questions too.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to put you all off.
I'm a master's student here, and it was here that I first heard the statistic that only 3% of PhD students are, at least in biology, now having their own lab. And it's part of the reason that I came to the talk was to hear about your career path. But even though you said you found something outside of strictly lab science almost by accident, do you have any advice on how to learn more about careers outside of science while in it?
Okay, so here's the thing. If you do a PhD and you don't end up as an academic scientist, you've not failed. Yeah. And there's this real problem in academia that it's assumed that you've sort of fallen if you don't become one of those, 3% who have their own lab or whatever. So here's the thing. Like a lot of other jobs, academia is totally rubbish at times, right? It can be awful and nasty and horrid. And everything is a trade-off. And there's lots of people who have lots to offer, lots of different things. And if academia is not your trade-off, you have not failed if you don't do it. And I actually think it's good if we've got people with PhDs who go out and do other things, because we need, everyone complains that there aren't enough scientists who are politicians or journalists or whatever. Well, if they all stayed doing, academia, there definitely wouldn't be any out in the rest of the world, even if Vince Cable thinks his PhD wasn't worth it, which I was very cross about. Anyway, so the first thing is, the statistic looks awful, but it's sort of based on a false premise. It's based on the premise that people should do a PhD and end up in academia. And as far as career path goes, like everything else, because it's about trade-offs, you've just got to work out what your trade-off is. And I am still an academic because it covers a load of bases, right? I can get proper intellectual satisfaction from digging down into a question, but I also get to muck about on the ocean. And then I do all this other stuff, which means that I can also write and do all these other things. And so academia works for me because of the things it allows me to do. But if it doesn't allow you to do those things, then you should go off and find something that does. So a lot of academia is stubbornness. There is that thing. You're finding out things that you don't know. If you knew what they were, a quote attributed to Einstein, if I knew what I was doing, it wouldn't be called science. So you do have to have the sort of stubbornness which goes, I am just going to do this until it works, or I'm going to do something until I've learned something from it. So Stubbornness doesn't ever go away as a valuable attribute. But in terms of learning about careers, watch as wide a variety of possibilities as possible. Don't just watch academics. Watch people in business, watch people who are teachers, watch people who do all these different things, and learn about all the different ways of having a job, because that means that if you end up in academia, first of all, you'll know what you don't know, because academics have this thing where they assume they know everything. They're terribly smug. And so you need to see all of those things and then see your place within it, and then you understand what it is you're doing and what it is you might need to learn, rather than just going, there's one way to be and I'm going to do that and I only want to do that. Being blinkers don't help anyone. So when it comes to learning about things, just put yourself in different environments, watch how other people do their jobs, and observe the ways that academia fails, because academia is a broken system in a lot of ways. It was set up, it hasn't changed for 100 years, and it is changing now. But in order to make those changes work in the future, we have to look at different ways of doing things. So there's no real career advice apart from just open your eyes and look at as many things as possible. Watch how things get done. But there is no magic answer. And if you carry on to do a PhD, or even if you don't, whatever it is, you've already got, you're a master's in science, yeah. So you've already got a scientific foundation, and you can take that and do great things with it. Doesn't matter whether or not you find a cure for cancer.
No more
Any
questions?
Shut you
Oh,
all
there's
up.
one here. One brave man.
Over the course of the last century, the representation of and respect for women in science has massively improved. At our current rate, do you see any particular timeline for when we can declare victory in this war, and how will we know when we've
Okay,
won?
so first things first, it's not a war, right? That zero-sum game thing doesn't benefit anyone. Women and whatever other minorities we're talking about, having them in the room benefits everyone. So the first thing is it's not a battle. It's not about, my two X chromosomes are going to, beat the field of the Y chromosomes, sort of boss them all into submission. So I sort of disagree with the premise of that bit. But I think that the current rate of change is actually quite rapid. It's frustrating. It feels to me like things are changing very slowly. But when I look back at what my mother had to put up with and what my grandmother had to put up with over the course of those generations, things actually have moved on a lot. So I think the pace of change never feels fast enough, but things are changing, and we have to keep that going. The question of whether the time when things are equal, the most beneficial time, because there's any number of studies showing that mixed gender groups work better than single groups of either gender, for example, is when it's just not an issue anymore, when no one feels left out because of that. We were having a discussion before about environments, where you might have a chat with someone which are women only or men only. And the problem is that sometimes a women-only chat is still appropriate, but only because we live in a gendered society. And when you've got past that, then you've won. So I think things are getting better. There's clearly stories in the news all the time which show us we're not there yet. But I don't think true equality is coming to our Western society for another 50 years. Real, proper equality. Because the problem is, it's like any task, the last bits take the longest, right? There are some hidden, some conscious bias, as well as unconscious bias, that is just going to die out with a generation. But most of society can move on more quickly. So I think we can make big improvements in the next 10 or 15 years, but I think true equality is going to be some way off. And that is all sorts of equality. People talk about gender equality, like I said, because it's easy, but it's really important not to forget that there are all sorts of different groups who feel marginalised, and all of them. It's not about, so the women are doing all right, so we're not going to worry about the, BAME, whatever that acronym is, groups. This is a thing for everyone, and the same rules apply to everyone. It doesn't matter whether it's gender or race or whatever it is. It's basically about respecting human beings. But humans are awkward. We like being tribal. So we're also fighting against human nature in the sense that we'll find tribes, but I'm happier with tribes that are football teams than genders. So it's going to be a while.
So on that philosophical question, we probably should end. There will be drinks, I think, in the buttery. Yes. Please come and join, and you can quiz Helen some more. And thank you all for coming, and thank you, Helen, in particular.